أهلا بيكم يا أصدقاء. هنا وسط الغبار اللي لسه عايش على صفحات الزمن هنفتح مخطوطات سرية.
قولوا لنا في التعليقات انتوا منين بتتابعونا ومن أي زمن تحبوا نبدأ الحكاية الجاية.
In the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered the remnants of a civilization that for centuries dominated the known world, yet was almost forgotten by history. One of the greatest libraries of the ancient world, carved stone reliefs depicting brutal conquests and vast palaces buried beneath the sands, all pointed to a single name, Assyria. Who were the Assyrians? How did a small trading city on the banks of the Tigris River rise to become the world's first true military superpower? And what caused the collapse of this empire that once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea? This is the story of the Assyrian Empire. Long before it became an empire known for its military might and administrative innovations, Assyria began as a modest city-state. Its name came from the city of Ashur, nestled on the west bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. The city of Ashur gave rise to a people and a culture, political entity that would eventually dominate large parts of the ancient Near East. But in its earliest days, Assyria was neither dominant nor widely known. It was one of many competing urban centers in the region of northern Mesopotamia. The earliest signs of human activity in Ashur date back to the 3rd millennium BCE, during the early dynastic period of Mesopotamian history. This was a time when city-states such as Lagash and Kish were thriving in the south, forming what we often call Sumer. These cities were more advanced, wealthier, and more politically developed than their northern neighbors. Still, northern Mesopotamia, with its more temperate climate and greater rainfall, had its own advantages. Over time, this region gave rise to new cities, including Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela. Ashur's earliest growth was tied to two major factors: trade and geography. Located along the Tigris River, it had access to the major trade routes that connected the resource-rich mountains of Anatolia with the urban centers of southern Mesopotamia. This position allowed Ashur's merchants to interact with a wide range of cultures, from the Hurrians in the north to the Sumerians and Akkadians in the south. During the 24th century BCE, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad extended its control over much of Mesopotamia. This was the first known empire in the region, and it left a lasting imprint. Though Ashur was likely a small peripheral city at the time, it would have come under Akkadian control. The influence of Akkadian language, administration, and religion spread northward. The people of Ashur began to adopt Akkadian as their spoken and written language. This early exposure to imperial rule and record-keeping planted seeds that would later grow into Assyria's own imperial ambitions. Following the fall of the Akkadian Empire in the late 22nd century BCE, Mesopotamia entered a period of fragmentation. City-states once again competed for dominance. In this context, Ashur began to grow more independent and economically active. One of the key periods in early Assyrian history was the so-called Old Assyrian period, which began around the 20th century BCE. While this period will be explored more fully in the next section, it is worth noting here that it marked the first time Ashur emerged as a real power center, albeit a modest one. The rise of Ashur as a city-state was not driven by conquest, but by commerce. Merchants from Ashur established a network of trading colonies, most famously at Kanesh in central Anatolia. These merchants were organized into powerful family businesses and regulated by the city's leadership. They traded tin, textiles, and other goods in exchange for silver and other Anatolian resources. The fact that Ashur's influence extended hundreds of miles to the north without military conquest is a testament to its commercial sophistication. At the political level, Ashur was governed by a unique blend of monarchy and oligarchy. The king was known as the Ishiak Ashur, or the steward of Ashur, rather than as an absolute ruler. This title reflected a sense that the city's true ruler was its patron deity, also named Ashur. The human king ruled on behalf of this god and was expected to uphold justice, oversee trade, and protect the community. In fact, major decisions were often made in consultation with a city assembly made up of prominent families and elders. This early form of shared governance stood in contrast to the absolute rule seen in some southern Mesopotamian cities. Religiously, Ashur developed a strong sense of local identity centered on its patron deity. Ashur the god originally had solar aspects, but over time he came to embody the martial and sovereign qualities that reflected the ambitions of the city itself. Assyria grew in power, the god became more and more central to its ideology. But in these early centuries, the religious life of the city revolved around temples, festivals, and rituals meant to maintain order and favor from the divine. It is also during this formative stage that Assyria began to develop a distinct cultural identity. While it borrowed heavily from Sumerian and Akkadian traditions in language, law, and literature, it adapted these elements to fit local conditions. For instance, early Assyrian legal documents show both continuity with earlier Mesopotamian codes and a distinct concern for commercial regulation, reflecting the city's mercantile orientation. By the 18th century BCE, Ashur came under the shadow of more powerful neighbors. The Amorite king Shamshi-Adad I conquered the city and incorporated it into a broader kingdom that stretched across northern Mesopotamia. Though technically not a native Assyrian, Shamshi-Ad played a significant role in shaping Assyrian institutions. He installed his sons in ensits, key cities, standardized administration, and expanded the use of written record-keeping. Under his rule, Ashur was part of a larger geopolitical framework that would foreshadow later Assyrian expansions. After the death of Shamshi-Adad, his kingdom quickly fragmented for several centuries afterward. Assyria would remain relatively subdued, sometimes independent, sometimes subordinate to stronger powers like Babylon or the Hurin kingdom of Mitanni. But the foundations laid in these early centuries, geographic positioning, commercial networks, religious identity, and administrative practices allowed Assyria to endure and eventually rise again. By the dawn of the second millennium BCE, Assyria was no longer just a small city hugging the Tigris River. The Old Assyrian period, which began around the 20th century BCE, marked a new chapter in its development. This was not yet the age of empires and conquests. Instead, it was an age of trade, diplomacy, and internal consolidation. During these centuries, Assyria evolved from a local city-state into a world commercial power that stretched far beyond its immediate borders. This transformation laid the economic and administrative groundwork that would later support imperial expansion. At the heart of the old Assyrian world was the city of Ashur. While it was not a large city by later standards, it had become a hub of commerce, tightly connected to trade routes running through the continent. Mountains, plains, and deserts of the Near East. Ashur's people, especially its merchant families, played a key role in building these routes into long-term economic systems. The merchants of Ashur were not merely traders. They were also political actors, diplomats, and keepers of records. Their activities reached far into Anatolia, especially to a site called Kanesh, known today as Kulpe in modern Turkey. Kanesh was home to the most important of the Assyrian trade colonies, or Karums. The term Karum refers to a commercial district often established near or within foreign cities where Assyrian merchants could live, store goods, and conduct business. These Karums were semi-autonomous. They operated under Assyrian law and were often protected by agreements with local rulers. In Kesha, archaeologists have discovered thousands of clay tablets written in old Assyrian cuneiform. Business records, letters, contracts, and legal texts, all packed in clay envelopes and sealed with personal stamps. These records tell us that Assyrian merchants engaged in a long-distance trade network that moved tin, textiles, and silver. Tin was particularly valuable because it was essential for making bronze, the dominant metal of the era. Since Mesopotamia had no natural sources of tin, Assyrian traders became middlemen, importing tin from the east and exporting it westward to Anatolia. In return, they brought back silver, which was used as currency and wealth in Ashur. The trade network was not managed by the state, but by large extended families. These families formed partnerships and financed caravans of donkeys that could carry goods across hundreds of miles. Fathers, sons, and brothers were often spread across different cities, maintaining businesses in both Ashur and Anatolia. Communication between them relied on clay tablets sent along the trade routes. Some of these letters even included complaints about poor quality textiles, delayed payments, or risky political conditions along the road, showing a world that feels surprisingly modern in its concerns. Although the state did not control trade, it did regulate it. The kings of Ashur, still titled as stewards of the god Ashur, set laws governing commerce and taxes. They worked closely with the merchant class and relied on them for revenue and influence. In return, these kings offered legal protection, oversight of weights and measures, and sometimes even diplomatic support when local Anatolian rulers caused problems for Assyrian merchants. One of the earliest well-documented rulers of this period was Arishem I, who reigned sometime in the early 20th century BCE. He is known for commissioning the construction of temples and for instituting regulations on commercial activities. Under his rule, trade flourished and Ashur continued to grow in wealth and importance. Later kings, such as Ikunem and Sargon I, also contributed to Ashur's development by maintaining these networks and keeping peace with Kulan, neighboring city-states. But it was during the reign of Shamshi-Adad I in the 18th century BCE that Assyria made its first real attempt at regional domination. While technically part of the Old Assyrian period, Shamshi-Adad's rule marked a temporary shift from trade-based influence to military and political expansion. Originally from the northwestern region near Mari, Shamshi-Adad seized control of Ashur and declared himself king. From there, he launched campaigns that extended his rule across much of northern Mesopotamia. Shamshi-Adad first established a broader kingdom that included cities such as Ekalatum, Nineveh, and Mari. He placed his sons in charge of key territories, most famously Yazma, Adu in Mari, and built a centralized administration that used written communication to manage regional affairs. His system of governance used tablets to keep records of grain, livestock, labor, and taxation. The infrastructure of bureaucracy and coordination he implemented foreshadowed later Assyrian imperial systems. Despite his success, Shamshi-Adad's kingdom was not long-lived. After his death, his sons were unable to hold the territory together. Within a generation, his political structure collapsed under pressure from rivals such as Hammurabi of Babylon and Zimri of Mari. Assyria returned to a more modest position in the region, though it retained much of the administrative knowledge and commercial strength it had gained. The influence of Assyria during the Old Assyrian period is sometimes overlooked because it was not marked by large-scale wars or territorial conquests. But this was a time of profound cultural and economic development. The use of written contracts, standardized legal forms, and private family archives suggests a society with a strong sense of law and order. The mobility of its merchants, combined with the long-term maintenance of trade colonies, shows a culture capable of strategic thinking and cross-cultural engagement. What also stands out is the pragmatic nature of Assyrian society during this time. Rather than relying on brute force, early Assyrians relied on negotiation, commerce, and alliances. Their interactions with Anatolian city-states required them to adapt, compromise, and communicate effectively. They built a reputation for consistency and fairness, qualities that helped them maintain access to valuable trade routes over generations. Religion continued to play a central role. The god Ashur remained the patron deity of the city, and kings continued to act as his earthly representatives. However, during this period, the religious dimension of kingship was closely tied to prosperity and justice rather than conquest or expansion. Kings were expected to uphold the laws, protect merchants, and maintain temples. By the end of the Old Assyrian period around the 17th century BCE, political instability in Mesopotamia and Anatolia disrupted long-standing trade patterns. The rise of powerful kingdoms such as Babylon to the south and the Huron kingdom of Mitanni to the northwest began to overshadow Assyria. Nevertheless, the institutions and cultural values developed during this time endured. The commercial habits, legal traditions, and administrative practices of the Old Assyrian period would resurface centuries later during Assyria's imperial phase. Following the commercial expansion and early political ambition of the Old Assyrian period, the city of Ashur entered a long and difficult phase. From approximately the 17th century BCE to the mid-4th century BCE, Assyria experienced a steep decline in influence and autonomy. Surrounded by rising regional powers, its independence was gradually eroded. This was not a time of glory or conquest, but rather one of survival, adaptation, and quiet endurance. The causes of this downturn were both internal and external. Internally, Assyria had become politically unstable following the collapse of the short-lived kingdom established by Shamshi-Adad I. His death left a power vacuum that his successors could not effectively fill. The cities he had controlled quickly broke away or were conquered by more powerful neighbors. This fragmentation made it difficult for Ashur to project power or defend its interests in a changing political landscape. Externally, two significant forces began to shape the region: the rise of Babylon in the south and the emergence of the Huron kingdom of Mitanni in the northwest. Both of these states sought control over trade routes, river valleys, and strategically important cities, placing Assyria squarely in the path of larger geopolitical ambitions. Babylon, under the rule of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, had already expanded northward. After the fall of Shamshi-Adad-Adad's kingdom, Hammurabi absorbed parts of central Mesopotamia and temporarily extended his influence toward the Tigris region. However, Babylonian control over Assyria remained limited and did not last beyond his reign. It would take more than a century for Babylon to again become a dominant threat. In contrast, the threat from the northwest proved more enduring. The Hurons, a culturally distinct people from the Zagros and Armenian highlands, had been growing in power and organization. By the middle of the 16th century BCE, they had formed the Kingdom of Mitanni. This state rapidly expanded across northern Mesopotamia and Syria, pushing into regions once linked to Assyria through trade or loose political influence. The Mitanni court developed a refined culture, adopted elements of Mesopotamian religion, and relied on a warrior aristocracy that prized horse-drawn chariots, then the height of military technology. As Mitanni expanded, it absorbed key cities and trade routes that once connected Ashur to Anatolia and the Levant. Though Ashur itself may not have been directly annexed at first, it fell under the political and military shadow of Mitanni. Assyria, once an economic node of long-distance trade, was now largely landlocked between powerful neighbors. It retained its urban structure and religious institutions, but its merchants lost access to distant markets, and its kings lost the freedom to pursue independent policy. This period is sometimes referred to as Assyria's Dark Age, not because of complete collapse, but due to the relative silence in the historical record. Fewer texts survive from this time, and Assyrian inscriptions become scarce. What we do know comes mainly from references in foreign archives, especially those of Babylon, Mitanni, and Egypt. These sources reveal that Ashur continued to exist as a city with local governance and a religious life centered on its patron deity Ashur. However, it functioned under the authority, or at least the influence, of larger powers. While this subordination may seem like a setback, it had long-term consequences that ultimately benefited Assyria. Under Mitanni oversight, Assyria was not destroyed or dismantled. Its administrative systems continued to function. Its temples remained active, and its local elites retained some control over civic affairs. In a way, this allowed Assyrian institutions to survive and even mature while avoiding the pressures of overreach or war. When the time came for Assyria to reassert itself, it would do so with a stronger internal foundation. Moreover, the Huron and Babylonian presence influenced Assyrian culture. Assyrian scribes continued to copy and adapt Babylonian legal codes, literature, and administrative formats. At the same time, contact with the Hurons exposed Assyria to new military technologies, artistic styles, and diplomatic practices. In later centuries, the Assyrian army would become famous for its use of chariots, siegecraft, and disciplined infantry. Developments that have roots in the innovations introduced during this period of foreign dominance. By the 15th century BCE, the international system of the ancient Near East had evolved into a competitive network of great powers. These included Egypt, Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittites. Each of these states maintained diplomatic relations, exchanged royal correspondences, and occasionally fought wars for supremacy. Assyria, by contrast, remained on the margins of this system. It was not included in the royal correspondences preserved in Amarna in Egypt. It had no ambassadorial presence in the courts of Egypt or Hatti. It was, in effect, a regional minor player. However, change was on the horizon. During the 14th century BCE, the kingdom of Mitanni began to weaken. Internal strife combined with pressure from the rising Hittite Empire under kings such as Super-Aliyama I eroded Mitanni's curatorial control. At the same time, a new line of kings emerged in Ashur, beginning with Ashur-Bailit I. These rulers took advantage of the shifting power dynamics to reassert Assyrian independence. Ashur-Rubal I broke decisively with the era of subordination. He declared himself king of the universe and initiated a series of military campaigns that began to reclaim territory lost during the Mitanni period. He also engaged in diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, signaling that Assyria was ready to enter the club of great powers. His rise marks the beginning of the Middle Assyrian period, a phase of aggressive expansion, state-building, and cultural consolidation. In the 14th century BCE, after generations of foreign domination and regional obscurity, Assyria began to re-emerge as a political and military force. This revival marked the beginning of the Middle Assyrian period, a transformative era that saw Assyria evolve from a modest city-state into an ambitious regional kingdom. The key to this resurgence was a series of dynamic rulers, beginning with Ashur-Uballit I, who recognized the opportunity presented by the decline of Mitanni and seized it to assert Assyrian independence and authority. Ashur-Uballit I came to the throne in the mid-14th century BCE, likely around the 1400 BC. Year 1350. His reign marked a decisive break from the past. For the first time in many generations, the Assyrian king rejected the status of vassal and claimed sovereign authority. He no longer styled himself merely as a governor on behalf of the god Ashur. Instead, he adopted more assertive titles such as Great King and King of the Universe, titles previously reserved for rulers of the most powerful states in the Near East. This shift in political language was more than symbolic. Ashur-ubalot launched military campaigns to reclaim territories that had once been part of the old Assyrian trade network. He confronted the weakening forces of Mitanni and began to push westward and southward, asserting Assyrian control over key trade routes and fertile lands. His most notable success was the defeat of a Mitanni-backed ruler in the city of Arava, an important urban center in the eastern Tigris region. With this victory, Assyria gained both prestige and strategic depth. Ashur-ubalot also demonstrated his ambitions on the diplomatic stage. He sent letters to the Egyptian pharaoh, part of the famous Amarna correspondence discovered centuries later. In one such letter, Ashur-ubalot addressed the pharaoh as an equal, a bold move that reflected Assyria's rising status. Although the Egyptian court initially seemed surprised by Assyria's claim to great power, the very existence of this exchange shows that Assyria was re-entering the regional stage. Following Ashur-ubalot's reign, his successors continued to build on the momentum. Kings such as Adad-nirari I and Shayazer I expanded the kingdom's borders further and established a firmer administrative structure. Adad-nirari I campaigned against what remained of Mitanni and succeeded in incorporating large portions of its former territory into the Assyrian state. He also pushed into the Zagros Mountains to the east, asserting dominance over local hill tribes and securing resource-rich areas. These military efforts were accompanied by administrative reforms. The Middle Assyrian kings began to create a more centralized and organized bureaucracy. Provinces were established and governed by officials directly appointed by the king. These officials were responsible for collecting taxes, mobilizing labor, and maintaining local order. They reported regularly to the central government, creating a system of oversight that ensured loyalty and reduced the likelihood of rebellion. The army, too, underwent significant development during this period. Assyria built a standing force that could be mobilized quickly and moved efficiently across its growing territory. This military machine was supported by a logistical network that provided supplies and transport. The Middle Assyrian state also began using deportations as a political tool, relocating populations from rebellious or conquered regions to other parts of the kingdom where they could be more easily controlled and integrated. Under Shalmaneser I, who ruled in the late 13th century BCE, Assyria's ambitions expanded westward. He conducted campaigns against the Hittite-controlled regions of Syria and took the city of Kamish, a major trading center on the Euphrates River. While he did not permanently hold these western lands, the campaigns demonstrated Assyria's growing confidence and capacity to project power far from its core. It was during this time that Assyria also began to refine its ideological framework. The king was increasingly portrayed as the earthly agent of the god Ashur, whose divine will justified expansion and conquest. This religious justification for empire would become a hallmark of later Assyrian propaganda. Temples were constructed and renovated, and royal inscriptions emphasized the king's role in restoring justice, punishing the wicked, and maintaining cosmic order. Tuinorta I, the son of Sheomaner I, took the Middle Assyrian state to new heights. His reign, which began in the early 12th century BCE, was marked by a series of dramatic military victories and a bold challenge to Babylonian power. In a series of campaigns, Tukulti-Ninurta defeated the Kassite rulers of Babylon and captured the city itself. He even took the statue of the god Marduk, a deeply symbolic act that humiliated the Babylonians and asserted Assyrian supremacy. For a brief period, Assyria controlled both northern and southern Mesopotamia, an extraordinary achievement. Tukulti-Ninurta declared himself king of Sumer and Akkad, a title that had long been associated with the rulers of Babylon. He also commissioned the construction of a new capital city, Kartukuli-Ninurta, across the river from Ashur. This ambitious building project was meant to reflect his divine favor and political vision, though it was short-lived. Despite his military and administrative accomplishments, Tuli-Ninurta's reign ended in turmoil. His aggressive centralization of power and religious reforms alienated key segments of the Assyrian elite. His decision to elevate the god Ashur above all others, including the traditional Mesopotamian pantheon, created tension with religious authorities. Eventually, he was overthrown and killed in a palace revolt led by his own son. The instability that followed Tukulti-Ninurta's death weakened Assyria for a time, but it did not undo the advances of the Middle Assyrian period. The administrative structures he and his predecessors had built endured. The idea of Assyria as a dominant regional power had taken root. The army remained disciplined, and the provinces continued to function. Even in decline, the kingdom did not collapse entirely. Culturally, this period also saw important developments. Legal texts, such as the Middle Assyrian laws, were compiled during this time. These laws covered a wide range of issues, including family matters, property rights, and punishments for various crimes. They provide valuable insight into Assyrian society, particularly its treatment of women, slaves, and social hierarchies. While often harsh by modern standards, these laws were part of a broader effort to create order and stability in a growing and diverse state. By the end of the 12th century BCE, however, Assyria began to face serious external challenges. The broader Near East was entering a period of upheaval. The Hittite Empire collapsed under the pressure of invasions and internal decay. The Minoan kingdoms in Greece fell, and Egypt entered a phase of decline. In this context, Assyria, too, began to contract. The Aramaeans, a group of nomadic tribes from the western desert, began to raid and settle in formerly Assyrian lands. The kingdom's borders shrank and its central authority weakened. But unlike many of its neighbors, Assyria did not disappear. It had built a durable foundation, a professional army, a functioning bureaucracy, and a strong ideological core. These institutions would survive the coming challenges and eventually enable a much more powerful resurgence. As the Middle Assyrian period entered its final phase, the kingdom found itself at a critical juncture. While its military institutions and administrative foundations remained strong, external threats and internal pressures had begun to chip away at the stability established by earlier rulers. It was in this context, around the early 12th century BCE, that Tiglath-Pileser I ascended the throne. His reign would mark the final great flourish of the Middle Assyrian Empire and would stand as a powerful statement of ambition, reform, and cultural achievement. Tiglath-Pileser I came to power at a time when Assyria was facing mounting challenges. The kingdom's western territories had become increasingly unstable due to incursions by Aramaean tribes. In the north, various mountain peoples were asserting their independence, threatening Assyrian control over critical roads and resources. Meanwhile, to the west and southwest, the collapse of major powers such as the Hittite Empire had left a vacuum that ambitious rulers sought to fill. Tiglath-Pileser recognized these shifting dynamics and set out to reassert Assyrian dominance across the region. One of the defining features of his reign was a series of aggressive military campaigns that targeted nearly every frontier of the kingdom. His annals, lengthy inscriptions recording his exploits, reveal a determined strategy to restore control over key territories and to project power far beyond Assyria's core. Cities. His campaigns stretched west into Syria, north into Anatolia, and east into the Zagros Mountains. In his inscriptions, Tiglath-Pileser proudly claimed to have crossed the Euphrates River multiple times and even to have reached the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. While such boasts should be read with caution, they reflect a real expansion of Assyrian influence. One major military target during his campaigns was the land of Nai, a region composed of loosely organized tribes and small kingdoms in the mountainous areas of southeastern Anatolia. This region had strategic importance due to its access to timber, metals, and trade routes. Tiglath-Pileser's campaigns there were not just punitive. They were aimed at incorporating these regions into the Assyrian sphere through tribute, treaties, and sometimes direct control. He took hostages, demanded oaths of loyalty, and often deported rebellious populations to ensure compliance. In the West, he faced the growing threat of Aramaean groups who had begun to settle in areas previously under Assyrian influence. These semi-nomadic tribes were not easily subdued. Rather than operating as a single unified enemy, the Aramaeans moved in scattered bands, launching raids and then retreating into difficult terrain. Tiglath-Pileser's response was to establish fortified centers and garrisons to monitor and respond to Aramaean activity. He also carried out large-scale deportations, resettling captured Aramaean groups in Assyrian-held territories, a strategy that would be used with increasing frequency in later centuries. Aside from his military achievements, Tiglath-Pileser I is also notable for his contributions to Assyrian culture and royal ideology. He was a patron of the arts, a builder of temples, and one of the first Assyrian kings to present himself not only as a warrior, but also as a scholar and civilizer. In his inscriptions, he boasted of his knowledge of languages, his interest in religious texts, and his restoration of ancient traditions. He presented himself as a king who ruled not only with the sword, but also with wisdom. One particularly important temple restoration under Tiglath-Pileser's reign was that of the temple of the god Ashur in the city of Ashur itself. This was more than a religious act. It was a reaffirmation of the king's legitimacy and the central role of the divine in Assyrian kingship. By rebuilding and embellishing temples, the king reinforced his position as the chosen servant of the gods. He also added to the city's prestige, transforming Ashur into not just a political capital, but a spiritual center. His reign also saw the compilation and preservation of royal inscriptions and historical records. These texts served multiple purposes. They glorified the king, recorded legal and administrative matters, and preserved cultural memory. Tiglath-Pileser's use of these inscriptions set a precedent for later Neo-Assyrian rulers who would expand this tradition into elaborate narrative reliefs and monumental inscriptions. In foreign affairs, Tiglath-Pileser skillfully navigated a fractured geopolitical landscape. With the Hittite Empire in ruins, the Levant was a patchwork of city-states and local powers. Rather than attempting to annex these regions outright, Tiglath-Pileser imposed tribute, demanded loyalty, and sought to control trade routes. This flexible approach allowed Assyria to extend its influence without overextending its resources. His interactions with the city of Byblo and other Phoenician ports opened channels of exchange that brought cedar wood, luxury goods, and naval knowledge into Assyrian hands. Domestically, Tiglath-Pileser implemented measures to stabilize the economy and consolidate central authority. He reasserted control over the provincial governors, increased taxation efficiency, and regulated the flow of goods. He also restructured parts of the army to make it more responsive to both internal threats and frontier warfare. These administrative reforms helped preserve Assyria's strength during the turbulent years that followed his death. Despite his many accomplishments, Tiglath-Pileser's success was not permanent. After his reign, which lasted for approximately 4 decades, Assyria once again began to weaken. Successors struggled to maintain the vast network of tribute-paying regions and to fend off renewed Aramaean pressure. The ambitious expansions of Tiglath-Pileser had extended Assyria's reach, but also revealed its limits. The infrastructure and systems he built endured, but they required constant maintenance and military enforcement, burdens that later kings were not always able to carry. Even so, Tiglath-Pileser I's legacy was long-lasting. He had demonstrated that Assyria could be more than just a regional kingdom. He had shown that it could influence distant lands, shape international politics, and cultivate a distinctive cultural identity. His reign became a model for future kings, particularly during the Neo-Assyrian period, when many of his ideas and strategies would be revived on a grander scale. His emphasis on royal legitimacy, divine favor, and historical continuity helped shape the ideology of kingship that defined Assyrian imperial culture for centuries. His military campaigns opened pathways and relationships that would later be exploited during the full rise of the empire. And his contributions to Assyrian art, language, and architecture enriched the civilization's identity. Following the ambitious reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, the Assyrian kingdom entered a prolonged period of difficulty and contraction. While the foundations of the Middle Assyrian state remained intact, its reach was diminished and its dominance severely challenged. From roughly the late 12th century BCE through much of the 11th century BCE, Assyria faced internal weakness and mounting external threats, most notably from the west in the form of the Aramaean incursions. This was not merely an Assyrian problem. The entire Near East was undergoing a period of profound transformation. Many once powerful states collapsed or retreated. The Hittite Empire had disintegrated into smaller principalities. Egypt's influence in the Levant had been curtailed. Trade routes were disrupted, cities depopulated, and new peoples, particularly the so-called Sea Peoples and Aramaeans, began to move across the region in unpredictable ways. This era of instability is often referred to as part of the Late Bronze Age collapse, a widespread systemic crisis that reshaped the political landscape. For Assyria, the most immediate and enduring threat came from the Aramaeans. These were Semitic-speaking tribal groups originating from the deserts and steppes of Syria. Unlike earlier nomadic peoples, the Aramaeans were not just raiders. Over time, they began to settle in formerly urbanized areas, establishing towns, cultivating land, and forming small polities. Their movements were fluid and decentralized, which made them difficult for the more rigid Assyrian state to counter through conventional warfare. During the decades after Tiglath-Pileser I's reign, Aramaean groups began crossing the Euphrates and penetrating deep into Assyrian-controlled territory. They raided settlements, disrupted agriculture, and challenged Assyrian authority in the western provinces. These incursions were not isolated events, but part of a larger pattern of migration and settlement that gradually altered the demographic and political character of the region. Assyrian kings responded with military campaigns, but these efforts were often reactive and short-lived. The kingdom was suffering from internal weaknesses that made sustained defense difficult. Several factors contributed to this vulnerability. First, royal succession became less stable with frequent changes in leadership. Second, the economic base of the state had been weakened by the loss of tribute-paying regions and the disruption of trade. Third, the constant need for military responses to Aramaean pressure strained the administrative and logistical capacities of the kingdom. One example of these struggles can be found in the reign of Ashur-bel-kala, a king of the early 11th century BCE. He attempted to reassert Assyrian control through military campaigns and even secured a marriage alliance with Babylon. However, his reign was marked by instability, and after his death, the royal line fragmented. A period of succession disputes and short reigns followed, weakening the central authority even further. During this same period, the Aramaeans moved beyond mere raiding and began settling permanently in northern Mesopotamia. They occupied territories along the Kabor River, established new settlements near the Tigris, and, in some cases, took over old Assyrian administrative centers. The city of Nineveh, once a symbol of Assyrian strength, fell into decline and partial abandonment during this time. Other provincial towns were overrun or heavily damaged. The Aramaean presence had a long-term impact on the region. They introduced their language, Aramaic, which eventually became the lingua franca of much of the Near East. Though initially perceived as a threat, the Aramaeans would later be absorbed into the Assyrian administrative and military systems, and their language would even be used in official correspondence during the Neo-Assyrian period. But during the 11th century BCE, they represented a serious existential challenge. Compounding the Aramaean threat was the growing power of Babylon to the south. Although the Kassite dynasty in Babylon had been overthrown, the southern kingdom remained a potent rival. Periodic conflicts between Assyria and Babylon continued during this time, further draining Assyrian resources and attention. While neither side was able to achieve total dominance, the constant warfare contributed to a general atmosphere of insecurity and economic hardship internally. The Assyrian state began to fragment. Central control over the provinces weakened, and local governors gained more autonomy. Tax revenues declined, and royal building projects slowed. There is evidence that in some areas agriculture was abandoned or significantly reduced due to insecurity and depopulation. Temple inscriptions and royal annals from this period are scarce, suggesting a general decline in record-keeping and state-sponsored construction. Yet even in decline, Assyria did not vanish. The core cities, Ashur, Nineveh, Arbala, remained inhabited and maintained their cultural and religious traditions. The worship of the god Ashur continued, and temples still functioned, albeit with reduced resources. The continuity of these institutions provided a sense of identity and stability that helped Assyria endure through these lean years. It is important to recognize that this period of contraction was not unique to Assyria. The broader ancient world was undergoing what some scholars call a systems collapse, in which interconnected networks of trade, diplomacy, and administration broke down across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. In this context, Assyria's survival, even in diminished form, was a notable achievement. Toward the end of the 11th century BCE, signs of stabilization began to appear. A new royal line emerged in Ashur, more disciplined and focused on restoring order within the heartland. While the western provinces remained contested, central Assyria began to recover administratively and economically. The local elites, who had maintained continuity during the crisis, began to work with the monarchy again, and some limited campaigns were launched to reassert control over lost territories. By the beginning of the 10th century BCE, East Assyria stood at a crossroads. After more than a century of decline, marked by Araman incursions, internal fragmentation, and diminishing central authority, the kingdom remained intact but diminished. Its core cities, Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbala, continued to function, but Assyria's political reach had largely collapsed. The provinces that once extended deep into Syria and beyond had either been lost or heavily compromised. In this fragile context, a new ruler emerged, Ashur-dan II. Ashur-dan II reigned during the early decades of the 10th century BCE, and although his name may not be as widely recognized as some of his successors, His reign marked a turning point in Assyrian history. He did not inherit a strong empire, but his steady efforts laid the structural groundwork for what would become the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an empire that would eventually dominate the Near East for nearly 3 centuries. Ashur-dan II began his reign with a focused objective to secure and consolidate the Assyrian heartland. His early campaigns were not directed toward distant lands or symbolic victories, but were concentrated in northern Mesopotamia, particularly in areas that had fallen into Aramean hands. During the previous century, the focus was pragmatic: reclaim control of land, restore agricultural production, and reassert administrative authority. He targeted the foothills of the Zagros Mountains to the east and the territories along the upper Tigris and its tributaries. These areas were crucial for the food supply and for maintaining safe communication lines between the core cities. The Aramean tribes, although not organized into formal states, had settled in many of them. These regions. Ashur-dan's campaigns involved not only direct military action, but also the re-establishment of fortresses and garrisons to maintain control over these strategic zones. One of the significant features of Ashur-dan's rule was the reoccupation of abandoned lands. During the crisis of the previous century, many agricultural regions had been depopulated due to insecurity and Aramean pressure. Assyrian initiated a deliberate policy of resettlement, encouraging the return of farmers and the rebuilding of villages. He restored irrigation systems and worked to bring economic life back to areas that had long been neglected. This restoration of agricultural productivity was not simply a matter of economic policy, it served a political purpose. A reliable food supply meant a stronger state, capable of feeding its army and supporting its bureaucracy. Resettled populations were more easily taxed and monitored. By investing in the heartland first, Ashur-dan strengthened the central state's capacity for future expansion. Another important aspect of his reign was the reorganization of the military. The army, which had suffered from disuse and disrepair during the prior century, began to be rebuilt into a professional force. While not yet as large or specialized as the armies of later Neo-Assyrian kings, this new force was more disciplined, more mobile, and increasingly equipped to deal with both tribal raids and fortified urban resistance. Ashur-dan II also reasserted royal authority over provincial governors. These officials, who had gained considerable autonomy during the preceding period of decline, were brought back under tighter central control. The king reappointed loyal governors and created new administrative units where necessary. These efforts helped ensure that tribute and military levies were collected more efficiently and that local power didn't rival the throne. Although Ashur-dan's military campaigns were mostly regional, they extended far enough to re-establish Assyrian influence over key borderlands. His annals record victories over local tribes and petty kings in the northern mountains and over Aramean settlements to the west. These campaigns often involved the traditional practices of tribute collection and deportation of rebellious populations. However, unlike in later periods, these actions were still relatively limited in scale. The ideology of kingship during Ashur-dan's time began to shift subtly. While the king still acted as the steward of the god Ashur, there was a renewed emphasis on restoring divine order by reclaiming lost territory. This concept that the king's legitimacy rested on his ability to maintain and restore the territorial and ritual integrity of Assyria would become central in later Neo-Assyrian ideology. Ashur-dan's inscriptions speak of repairing temples, honoring the gods, and restoring justice in the land, blending religious duty with political strategy. Culturally, his reign marked a quiet but significant revival. Inscriptions, and building projects, while modest compared to later periods, resumed after a long silence. Stone inscriptions detailing military campaigns and temple restorations have survived, providing rare glimpses into this transitional era. These texts are more concise and practical than the elaborate annals of later rulers, but they reflect a renewed confidence in the durability and legitimacy of the Assyrian state. Ashur-dan II's reign is sometimes viewed as the bridge between the Middle and Neo-Assyrian periods. While he did not expand the empire in dramatic ways or launch monumental building programs, he restored the basic institutions of the state, revived the military, and re-established Assyrian presence in its core territories. These efforts would be expanded dramatically by his successors. In particular, his son and successor, Adad-nirari II, would take up his father's legacy and begin the outward expansion. That would mark the true beginning of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Building on the secure foundations laid by Ashur-dan, Adad-nirari would lead campaigns deep into Babylonia and westward into Syria. He would formalize administrative reforms and elevate Assyria once again to the level of a great power. In the early 9th century BCE, Assyria underwent a dramatic transformation under the rule of Ashur-nasir-pal II. His reign not only marked a new phase of imperial expansion, but also introduced key political, military, and cultural innovations that would define the Neo-Assyrian Empire at its height. He was both a brutal military commander and a patron of the arts, a ruler who governed through fear and awe, and who reshaped the very idea of Assyrian kingship. Ashur-naril II came to power around the year 883 BCE, succeeding his father, Tukulti-Ninurta II. While his father had made steady gains in re-establishing Assyrian power in northern Mesopotamia, Ashur-nasir-pal's ambitions were much broader. He envisioned a renewed empire not just focused on defensive consolidation, but on aggressive expansion and administrative reform. One of the earliest and most defining aspects of Ashur-nasir-pal's reign was his uncompromising use of military force. From the beginning, he launched a series of campaigns aimed at extending Assyrian control westward into Syria, northward into the mountainous regions of Anatolia, and eastward into the Zagros Mountains. These were not simply border skirmishes or opportunistic raids. They were systematic efforts to bring entire regions under Assyrian dominance through a mixture of overwhelming violence, strategic terror, and administrative integration. His campaigns against the tribes of the Zagros Mountains and the city-states of the Levant demonstrated both his military prowess and his ruthless policy toward resistance. In his royal inscriptions, Ashur-nasir-pal II described with disturbing detail the punishments inflicted on cities that refused to submit: impalements, flayings, mass deportations, and the destruction of fortifications. These accounts were not just historical records. They were tools of psychological warfare meant to intimidate future opponents and enforce compliance without the need for further battle. While the violent imagery in his inscriptions was undoubtedly exaggerated for effect, it is clear that Ashur-nasir-shakur viewed terror as a central instrument of rule. Unlike earlier kings who emphasized justice or divine stewardship, Ashur-pal presented himself as an unstoppable force appointed by the god Ashur to crush rebellion and extend divine order across the known world. But his ambitions were not limited to conquest alone. He was also deeply concerned with the consolidation and administration of the territories he conquered. Ashur-nasir implemented one of the earliest and most effective systems of provincial governance in Assyrian history. Conquered lands were divided into provinces, each overseen by an Assyrian governor appointed by the king. These governors were responsible for tax collection, maintaining local order, and supplying troops when required. Their loyalty was ensured through direct reporting to the central palace and frequent inspections. To further bind the empire together, Ashur-Nirapal made strategic use of mass deportation. Entire populations from rebellious or strategically important regions were forcibly relocated to different parts of the empire. This policy served multiple purposes. It weakened the resistance potential of newly conquered territories, provided labor for state projects, and mixed different ethnic groups to reduce local cohesion. While this practice may seem harsh, it became one of the defining strategies of Assyrian imperial policy and was used extensively by later kings. In addition to military and administrative reforms, Ashur-Nasir-Pal was a prolific builder. One of his most enduring legacies was the construction of a new capital city at Kalhu, known today as Nimrud. Situated on the Tigris River, Kalhu was chosen for its strategic location and its potential for development. Within just a few years, Ashur-Nasir-Pal transformed it into one of the most important cities of the empire. The construction of Kalhu was both a practical and symbolic act. It allowed the king to establish a fresh administrative center free from the traditional elite structures of Ashur, while also serving as a monument to his power and divine favor. The new city featured massive walls, ornate temples, and one of the largest palace complexes of the ancient world. Known as the Northwest Palace, this building became a model for later Assyrian palaces and was filled with carved reliefs depicting the king's campaigns, religious rituals, and scenes of royal life. These reliefs, carved in fine detail on stone slabs, represented a new form of political messaging. They combined text and image to present the king as a warrior, hunter, builder, and divine agent. In one panel, Ashur-Nirapal is shown pouring a libation over the bodies of fallen enemies. In another, he is leading a lion hunt, demonstrating both courage and control over chaos. These images were not just decoration. They were ideological statements meant to impress visitors, intimidate enemies, and reinforce the legitimacy of the royal house. Religiously, Ashur-Nasir-Pal remained a devout servant of the god Ashur, but he also promoted other deities within the Assyrian pantheon, including Ishtar, Nabu, and Ninurta. He restored and expanded temples throughout the empire, and his inscriptions often credited the gods with granting him victory and favor. This emphasis on divine support was central to his rule, as it framed his actions not only military conquests, but also administrative decisions as expressions of divine will. Economically, Ashur-Nas' expansionist policies brought in vast quantities of tribute from vassal states and conquered peoples. Horses, metals, timber, precious stones, and luxury goods flowed into Assyrian storehouses. These resources funded further campaigns, palace construction, and religious offerings. The wealth collected from across the empire also allowed the state to support artisans, scribes, and craftsmen, contributing to a flourishing of cultural activity. To celebrate the completion of his new capital at Kalhu, Ashur-Nal held a massive banquet, an event recorded in a commemorative inscription. He claimed to have fed more than 69,000 guests from across the empire, an event designed to showcase his wealth, generosity, and unchallenged dominance. Whether this figure was literal or symbolic, the message was clear. The king stood at the center of a vast, ordered, and prosperous world. When Ashur-Nal II died, the throne passed to his son, Shalmaneser III, who ruled from the mid-9th century BCE. Inheriting a strong army, a centralized administration, and the new capital at Kalhu, Shalmaneser faced both opportunity and challenge. His reign would test the limits of Assyrian expansion, particularly in the politically complex lands to the west. It was under Shalmaneser that Assyria encountered one of its most notable obstacles, a broad coalition of Levantine kings determined to halt Assyrian advance. This confrontation culminated in the famous Battle of Karkar. Shalmaneser III's reign began with momentum. Determined to continue the imperial ambitions of his father, he launched annual military campaigns, an approach that became a hallmark of Assyrian kingship. These expeditions served both military and economic purposes, asserting dominance, collecting tribute, and projecting the image of a king in perpetual motion. His targets included regions in the north, such as Urartu, and to the west into Syria and the Levant. The western territories were especially significant. These lands, composed of wealthy and independent city-states such as Arpad, Damascus, and Hamath, offered valuable access to trade routes, timber, metals, and agricultural wealth. Yet, unlike the fragmented hill tribes of the Zagros or the loosely organized settlements of the north, the Levantine kingdoms were politically organized, militarily capable, and deeply interconnected through diplomacy and trade. Assyrian expansion into this region would not go unchallenged. In the 6th year of his reign, Sheanzar led a major campaign westward, reaching as far as the Orontes River in modern-day Syria. It was in this context that one of the most significant military engagements of the early Neo-Assyrian period occurred, the Battle of Karkar. The Battle of Karkar took place around the year 853 BCE. Shelamar's annals described the confrontation in detail. According to these inscriptions, he faced a formidable alliance of 11 kings, the most notable of whom were Hadazar of Damascus and Ahab of Israel. Other members of the coalition included the kings of Hamath, Arwad, and Egypt, among others. Each ruler contributed troops and resources to resist the Assyrian advance. The battle was not just a military clash. It was a geopolitical event. For the first time, multiple states had coordinated a joint military response to Assyrian aggression. It reflected a growing awareness of the Assyrian threat and a willingness to set aside local rivalries in favor of a collective defense. Shanzar claimed victory in his inscriptions, listing the vast numbers of enemy soldiers slain and cities subdued. He recorded that he engaged in battle and routed the coalition forces, driving them back. However, most historians now believe that the battle was either inconclusive or perhaps even a strategic setback for Assyria. Despite the king's declarations, there is no evidence that Assyria gained permanent control over the coalition cities in the immediate aftermath of Karkar. In fact, Sheanzar returned to the region repeatedly in subsequent years to deal with continued resistance. The Battle of Karkar highlights an important pattern in Assyrian military history. Even though Assyria possessed a superior military in terms of organization and resources, it faced serious limitations when dealing with well-organized coalitions. The costs of sustained campaigning, the difficulty of occupying fortified cities, and the resistance of local populations all placed constraints on Assyrian ambitions. Despite this, Sheanzar III did not relent. Over the next several decades, he continued to campaign across multiple fronts. In the north, he fought against the kingdom of Urartu, a powerful and rising state centered in the highlands of eastern Anatolia. In the east, he targeted the Zagros mountain tribes. In the west, he returned to the Levant multiple times, gradually weakening the unity of the anti-Assyrian coalition. In addition to military activity, Shadowmanzar devoted attention to public works and propaganda. He expanded the city of Calhoun, adding new temples and administrative buildings. Most famously, he commissioned the Black Obelisk, a tall, four-sided monument covered in inscriptions and reliefs that detail his campaigns and the tribute received from subject kings. This obelisk provides one of the most valuable historical records of the period and includes the first known depiction of an Israelite king, Gu of Israel, bowing before Sheanzar in submission. The obelisk was not just a monument to victory. It was a visual tool of royal ideology. It depicted Sheanzar as a universal ruler, one to whom foreign kings paid tribute and swore loyalty. Through these images and inscriptions, the Assyrian court crafted a narrative of uninterrupted dominance, even when military outcomes were more ambiguous. Shamazar also introduced some administrative refinements. As the empire grew, so did the need for more efficient communication, taxation, and governance. He expanded the provincial system, established more direct control over newly conquered areas, and standardized the reporting mechanisms between governors and the central palace. These administrative practices allowed the empire to function more smoothly, even as its geographic scope widened. However, the latter part of his reign revealed the challenges of sustaining a vast imperial enterprise. As Shamasa aged, internal divisions within the royal court began to surface. His sons vied for power, and the central administration grew strained under the demands of constant warfare. In his final years, civil conflict broke out. A rebellion led by one of his sons, Shamshi-Adad V, erupted, and a prolonged struggle for succession destabilized the North Sea Empire. Kingdom. Though Shalmaneser III had expanded Assyria's influence and conducted more campaigns than any previous king, his final years showed the limits of military expansion without corresponding internal cohesion. The civil war that followed his death would temporarily stall Assyria's westward advance and allow its enemies some breathing room. Nevertheless, the foundations laid by Shalmaneser would endure. His military campaigns, administrative reforms, and propaganda innovations shaped the next phase of Assyria. Assyrian imperialism. His successors would learn from both his triumphs and his failures, adopting new strategies to manage conquest, enforce loyalty, and maintain stability. The death of Shalmaneser III, one of the most active military kings of the Neo-Assyrian period, did not usher in a time of peace or consolidation. Instead, it marked the beginning of a prolonged and turbulent era in Assyrian history. This period, stretching from the late 9th century BCE to the mid-8th century BCE, was characterized by internal weakness, dynastic instability, regional rebellions, and a loss of centralized control. Although not a collapse, it was a clear regression from the unified imperial ambition that had defined the earlier decades. The roots of this instability lay in the succession struggle that began even before Shalmaneser's death. Toward the end of his reign, he had grown old and increasingly reliant on court officials and trusted generals. In this political vacuum, his sons began to position themselves for power. The most prominent of these was Shamshi-Adad V, who eventually emerged victorious, but only after a bitter civil war that lasted several years.